Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
When the images of Alan Kurdi washed up on a Turkish beach were flashed around the world exactly a year ago, politicians lined up to promise help for the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing war in places like Syria and Iraq. They did manage to secure an EU deal with Turkey to stem the flow of people heading for Europe, a journey Alan and his family had been trying to make. The deal led to a drop in numbers crossing into Greece from more than 200,000 last October to fewer than 2,000 in recent months. But that has far from solved the problem. As we reported last night, there are now 2.7 million refugees in Turkey, up 40% on a year ago. Governments in Europe had pledged to take some of those, but so far just 511 have been resettled. The UK separately pledged to take 20,000 Syrian refugees by 2020. So far, we've taken in barely 2,500. At the Home Office today, to mark a year since Alan's death, there were protests about what is seen as a lack of action from the UK and Europe. Earlier, I spoke to former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, who is now based in New York as head of a major humanitarian organisation dealing with refugees.
A year on from the terrible death of Alan Kurdi, the truth is that the refugee crisis is growing globally, not diminishing. 24 people every minute displaced from their homes by violence. And there's a desperate need to turn the words of politicians into substantive actions.
But if you take your hat off as a humanitarian worker or head of a humanitarian organisation and put your hat back on as a leading Western politician and diplomat, you can see the huge difficulties in trying to get a common agreed policy on the refugees, especially when everyone's policies on Syria is so divided anyway.
When I think back to the community I represented in South Shields, at the moment the UK government is committed to admitting about 6 refugees for every parliamentary constituency. I don't believe that's the limit of British generosity every year, nor do I believe that it's impossible for the United States, which has historically been a leader in refugee resettlement, to do much, much more. After all, Canada, the northern neighbour of the US, announced last year 25,000 refugees would arrive, and they were all there within 6 months.
As you say, I mean, within the United States, as well as here in Europe, there are a lot of politicians making policy based on a fear of refugees, that they could be somehow a fifth column for extremist groups. Has that made the situation more difficult in trying to press the case for refugees being allowed in more?
I think that the polarisation of political debate has made life much more difficult, above all for the refugees themselves, who do come to Western countries, but end up facing a mixture of fear on the one hand and compassion on the other. The UK has not yet met the commitment made by David Cameron at this time last year to admit 3,000 children, unaccompanied children, to the UK. The vetting is so significant that there are blockages in getting the required numbers of refugees, the pledged number of refugees into the country. And we always say, as an organisation that's committed to refugee resettlement, that we support effective security, but it has to be done in an efficient and an effective way.
The Syrian war is 5 years old. It seems that there are no signs of it easing in any way, shape or form. Do you think that politicians not so much have stopped listening, but find themselves unable to move the humanitarian case for helping the refugees forward anymore? I mean, you're in New York, there's a huge meeting in only a couple of weeks' time about the humanitarian situation in the Middle East and beyond.
I think it's particularly because of the ravaging war that's going on inside Syria and the difficulty of stopping it that we need to redouble our humanitarian efforts. The truth is that humanitarian action in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Europe, in the UK can offer some relief to some of those people who escape the war, and it's our duty to do so even while Western countries are finding it so difficult to adopt a coherent position that would do anything to bring the war inside Syria to an end.
Former Foreign Secretary David Miliband talking to me a little earlier.
I've been getting away with it all my